So Geburah, meaning severity, strength, sitting on the other side of the. If we look at it on the left side of the pillar, if we identify it with it on the right hand side, the counterpoint to Chesed, which means a mercy, where Geburah is kind of the limiting aspect of that mercy. I was talking about the closed fist and the open hand in terms of Geburah and Chesed, also of the protective sphere of Chesed being a closed fist, and Geburah is obviously related to the protective sphere of Chesed, that the sword, the fierce, strong hand that makes sure that the good, the value set of Chesed can just keep existing. But this makes it very complicated, because it's not as if such an order can be protected from the outside. It in fact is Chesed itself which has to protect itself. So Geburah is, and then the whole unfolding order below Geburah might be seen as an unfolding of the Chesedic sphere. So the whole tree below the abyss could be said to be Chesed, at least up until Hod, which indeed is character titled as such, as carrying in itself the deepest secrets of Chesed. But so Geburah is not a guard standing outside of the castle, slaying whoever tries to come in unwanted. It is the decision of the castle itself, or the lord of the castle, about which influences need to be warded off. That's really what it is. In the first instance, it is the judgment of what is Chesedic and what is not. So it's the first action of Geburah, the first Geburic action is discernment. It's not, in mysticism, the mental aspect, the discerning aspect, is usually connected to the things like swords and knives, as well as the element of air. But the knife of, that's what's going on here with discerning. Geburah gives us the opportunity, of the power to discern between good and evil, good and bad, based, of course, on the standards that Chesed gives us. So it's not like there's a... This is obviously contentious, because if you would ask, I would think, if you ask a profoundly religious rabbi about this, then he would say that there is an objective good which Chesed represents, and Geburah is just protecting that or enforcing that, but where it's being threatened. But what I'm stating as a non-religious entity, at least non-ideological, is that it is the very sphere of Chesed itself that kind of arbitrarily, in a sense, sets the values. And the Geburic instinct of discerning what belongs to these values and what not, is part of that value set. And this is where philosophy, post-Nietzschean philosophy, breaks with all doctrines, because it doesn't allow for objective value sets to precede the agents of those values, the humans or the animals, or in extreme case, the molecules. It's not like these values exist and then beings rise up to attain to them. It's the values are part of the beings, right? It's sort of their it might be said that all sorts of sets of values are prior to all sorts of sets of beings, but it's not like there is one objective set of values and it's just a matter of time before all of humanity embraces those values. It's more like all sorts of environments have different possibilities for valuings, and these possibilities tend to be filled in by different types of beings. So you get like say the Japanese type of being, completely adapted to the types of values possible in that part of the world, an isolated, very beautiful island group with this particular climate and soil and everything that produces this general type of situation for being, which then nature went on to exploit, and so that in the end it could really intensely value what was present, and thereby cause very intensely refined beings that value themselves in these terms that are available, these Chesedic terms, and their Geburic aspect of the Japanese, their whole samurai culture, is evidently a part of their Chesedic culture. Like one might say the honor aspect is what binds the two, Chesed and Geburah. Honor both describes what is good and commands what needs to be cut off, right? What honor gives the sense of discernment, of duty, of what is right and what's wrong, and that's not rooted in objectivity. That's rooted in history. If you compare that to Brazilian culture, you can see how that works. The Chesedic sphere of Brazilians it's much more frivolous, much more loose, which means that also the Geburic sphere is far less manifest. The Geburic, like in a very orderly society, it's very easy to see the Geburic aspect. So Geburah is definitely relates to order, where Chesed does not. Ironically, Chesed is sort of the order not in the word of in the sense of being orderly, but of the paradigm in which certain things make sense and other things don't, and sort of Geburah is the sense making, the active sense making, like the policing in a sense, or the schooling, the setting of boundaries and of regulations, of norms, and of trends and precedents, the way things are done. Now, I actually Brazil is an interesting. Kind of has me puzzled now, like how to even identify the Geburic aspect there. That's not easy. Without knowing the culture very well. I could say in Holland, for example, the Chesedic, that's a much better example for me as I'm from there. The Chesedic aspect includes things like freedom of opinion, freedom of trade, freedom of religion, a lot of freedoms from authorities, like the idea that the sense of being independent, self-determining, that is very much the Chesedic sphere. There isn't a lot on top of that. It's not like a holy heritage from sacred ancient spirits like the Japanese have. It's nothing to do with any Christ figure or with more ancient gods. It just Holland's very much defined very well historically by its will to be simply independent of great tyrannical authorities. It came to be, and so this is where the Geburic aspect is very easy to recognize in Holland. Its Chesedic sphere wanted to have self-determination, and its Geburic sphere then drew the conclusion and went to war with the Spanish oppressors, the Catholics. Took 80 years warfare to defeat them, kick them out, and establish firmly the boundaries of the Dutch Chesedic sphere, the independent Republic of the Netherlands. Geburah accomplished this based on the values, on the Chesedic values. So the power of Geburah to actually enforce Chesed is rooted in Chesed, but that's rooted then again in this unfathomable coming about of a particular instance of limitation from the abyss, through the abyss, from the limitless possibilities of form in Bina. So weirdly, that's the gist of it, I think. in order to say a hell of a lot more about Geburah, I would have to go into details and aspects and everything, which I should probably do. Okay, so the color of Geburah is a red, the main color associated with Mars symbols, things like swords and fire. And the path between Geburah and Chesed is the strength card. Also, it has a symbol of the tamed lion, so it's about the disciplining of the wild, which again is both like the wild is both, interestingly, like let's say the untamed lion could pertain both to the isolated Chesed and to, let's say, well, just in general to the Geburah, like say in its own right, like when the Geburah is engaged in war, it needs to be untamed. It cannot be bound by the laws that apply inside the Chesedic sphere. It's not like, say, society has the rule, thou shalt not kill, but then in order to protect that society wherein you cannot kill, it'll often have to kill a whole bunch of people outside of that society. So the combination of Chesed and Geburah would amount in the tamed lion, which is to say that it is capable of using violence where needed, but essentially is just reduced to its vigor in a sense. Let's say Geburah inside of the Chesedic sphere would simply amount to the vigor of the people and its resilience and its will to propagate their own Chesedic sphere. For example, let's say the United States in the 19th century, extremely vigorous, with all the pioneering culture still, enforcing its own Chesedic sphere on itself, in a sense, expanding its Chesedic sphere and setting the norms very strictly. Just harsh conditions, not a lot of pity for suffering, just the conditions to breed great strength, right? That would be the combination, and that is the name of the card of the path between Geburah and Chesed is strength. So that's when Geburah operates inside Chesed. Whereas if it operates outward, you get more things like, just for example, this desperate violence that radiates outward from the Islamic community, which consists of very many communities, which is in itself a sign that it's not very well integrated. The Geburah and the Chesedic sphere of the religion of Islam are not too well connected to each other, because it is a complete chaos on the inside, right? If there's violence outward, there's a lot more violence inside, which is just a symptom, in a sense, of there not being a proper Chesedic sphere, or let's say, there's not an integrated Chesedic sphere. The Geburah element is running rampant, sort of being found perhaps a little bit too scary to apply to the own community. There's not a lot of self-discipline or self-correcting in that community. It's only constantly, which is the word of the prophet, is, the ones who are to blame or in the wrong are essentially always the ones who are not yet in that Chesedic sphere, who are not yet Muslim. So the idea lives there that the more you just destroy or take or usurp of the non-religious sphere, the better you will be doing inside. What that is not proving to be the case. Rather, what is needed to be doing inside is also to apply those laws, the strictness of morality that one applies outward, also to one's own, to oneself, to the cultural sphere itself, which in Islam is a bit inconvenient because it has all these laws immediately of cutting off hands of a thief and stoning adulterers to death and all. Those are very Geburic laws, but they are not really refined. They haven't really evolved. They haven't really been in contact with this merciful. It seems like they're so harsh that the Chesedic sphere kind of couldn't really take them too seriously in a sense, and uses them symbolically here and there to sort of establish that okay, we are doing this, but at the same time it's just too cruel. You cannot regulate people like that. People are too sensitive to truly regulate it into a vigorous state by cutting off their limbs. That just doesn't really work. Especially not if there's not something very Chesedic, very joyful and proud and enjoyable standing against that sort of thing. So that does not bode well for that sphere. Whereas on the other hand, for example, our Western sphere, the more liberal West, is sort of having the opposite problem, where there's an absolute absence of Geburah corrective mechanism, which is why crime is so utterly rampant, and even our cultural identification is largely in terms of crime. And all our TV shows and all our music that we like are all about crime stories, about how to avoid the hard hand of the law, and to actually often the outlaw heroes type, or the crooked cops or whatever, they will be presented as the Geburah element, as the corrective element, because the law is just such bullshit and the individual can take care of himself. And in a sense, that is pretty cool, actually. Especially if it gets dissociated with the more depraved aspects of crime and just pushes forth the narrative that the Geburah impulse, that the culture is so vigorous that we only need some random individual to enforce the law, what is good. This is really what the West is, why it conquers, why it will win, why it will continue to conquer the world, because it puts the greatest responsibility on the individual. It allows for the individual to actually become the agent of the culture. And actually, that actually happens. That's how we do things, and that's why. Also, because ultimately, what else is there but individuals, or groups of them? But ultimately, it's all reducible only to the individual. So, if you attribute the actual strength to the individual instead of its collective, then you'll just be sort of, in terms of hard physics, you'll just prevail. It's the bottom line. So, but at this point, we're kind of looking. We have like Trump, you could say, is an extremely Geburah aspect, where the complete Chesedic culture, we are all the good, and we just need to pick someone who says he's really good, because then we can all feel even more extremely good about ourselves. That was going to be very that was going to destroy the Chesedic sphere entirely, because financially and militarily it was not tenable, let alone responsibly, because a Geburah instinct will sort of demand accountability, and the opponent of Trump already has a record of actions which a Geburah perspective will certainly condemn, because that's just too many errors, too many very lethal mistakes. So then you get Trump, the corrective Geburah, unpleasant aspect that sort of brings about a culture of disciplining. Certainly, he is now the one being disciplined the most, in a sense, because the whole country is falling over him and whipping him. But that just means that the culture has shifted from an entirely Chesedic sphere of excess into more of a process where Geburah and Chesed are being integrated, or where they're testing each other, and real discourse of power and of control, of self-control, of self-awareness, responsibility is arising again. It's not there yet, but I mean, the country's in fucking chaos, but like a self-seeking chaos. It's trying to center itself. It's trying to reestablish its values, which is a Geburah action, the state of affairs. And this is extremely, extremely positive, the state of affairs, compared to how it was 4 years ago, when it was just being assumed, it's going really badly, but we can't really do anything about this because we're just doing the best we can, in a sense. or we know that all humans are equal and good and blah blah. All this conditionless Chesedic will, like we want everybody to feel the same way we do, namely that all is love, and we'll let them just, and then sort of not look at the consequences or the lack of consequences, and then you get situations like Libya and Syria where just because it's totally this Chesedic thing about they don't dare to touch any tricky or touchy stuff, so then you get a whole piece of the world entirely rotting away in horrible violence because the Geburic aspect is not there, because the leading actor in the world is sort of chickening out from its own Geburic arm, its right arm, it's enforcing power. So you can see this now, even like the horrible mess. It's all like ISIS is being swiftly defeated since Trump is in office. It's already almost defeated, which is a very Geburic action. ISIS could be seen as the entirely excess of what I spoke about the Islamic sphere, only pointing its Geburic things outward. That, well, in this sense, it engendered a Geburic response from what it was attacking. And now Islam is being forced to look slightly, a little bit more into itself again. And I'm not in that religion, even though I've had a lot of experience with it. So I can't, and I don't want to judge now, or I don't want to even know now, because it's going to be thousands of years, right? Whatever happens, kind of pointless to sort of go into that. The only thing we can ask is our own. Well, the last thing I'll address now is Europe, because the Chesedic, that's such a clear example of where this integration of Chesed and Geburah could, well, it has been in process very intensely and is leading to results, because in theory, of course, the European Union is a Chesedic sphere, it's a coherent realm, right? But in practice, that's not entirely the case because, well, just look at the way it came about as a result of centuries and centuries of devastating wars between very many countries very close to each other. There was never any moment where there was the risk of peace, in a sense. The best thing was this balance of powers, this Westphalian agreement, but that was just because everybody was aware of being able to get destroyed very quickly by its neighbor. So then that actually happened, that total destruction, because it was sort of impending all the time, and then you get in the form of the two world wars. Apparently Germany is defeated, but 100 or like 70 years later, it turns out Germany is actually coming out as the victor, because what happened? Germany was, split up but being left alive. Immediately, what happened was France opted for a gas and coal union together with Germany, and then you can say gas and coal or steel and coal. I can't remember. These are basic values, right? So the Chesed, a very, very sort of basic Chesedic sphere, which actually relies on necessity, so a Geburic element, very clean, proper decision to unite based on values which can be said both to be Geburic and Chesedic, namely resources. But then this was kind of silly of France to do, and of course they were the real losers of the war, so they were in a weak position. But it was kind of weird to just get in bed with the aggressors of the war, with the country that just a year ago had Hitler at the head, and make this this contract between the two biggest nations of the continent. Essentially, just since also Germany is a much more, it's more populated, and it has it's known to have a greater industrial workforce and vigor. So that was all. It was kind of clear what was going to happen. Certainly, the Germans would have known. Anyway, what happened consequently was that mostly the EU became a Geburic aspect. It became mostly about, because the Germans are of course very Geburic, very much about setting limits. their inner line is very strong in a sense. They have a very strong tamed line that they can unleash and then sort of be very okay with themselves. They just set limits and limits and limits, and everybody wanted to come in because it was already so big. You know, France and Germany, they made this pact so that there would not be a war again, forging a kind of pretense to a Chesedic sphere, but basically all that happened was German rationale of austerity and discipline, which none of the other countries could really keep up with, except maybe, you know, the Dutch and the North Italians, the Swiss, which are not even part of the EU, and the Austrians, in a sense, just those sober Germanic type. They went on and built great industry and banking structures, and a lot of Geburah, just powerful things that keep structures in place, but not a lot of Chesedic, let's say, lushness was basically, I mean, I don't know if that's a little bit exaggerated, but it feels to me like the EU has not produced any culture whatsoever since its existence, except, you know, Rammstein or some very rare expressions, radical expressions. But the EU is simply not a cohesive Chesedic sphere, right? It has too many, like, you cannot put Italy and Belgium in the same thing and then pretend it's the same thing. It's fundamentally different. So that's why it doesn't work culturally. But still, financially, it does work in a sense of just it is in itself sort of the model of discipline in the world, the German version of EU banking. And now that it has sort of thereby by German policies compelled the Brits to leave, which is extremely Geburah, cutting off. Now the Chesedic sphere is finally coming into being. You see, because when the Brits entered, I think Germany wasn't probably even united yet, so the Brits were still sort of had the perspective of rulership. I guess that's what their idea was. Let's rule the EU, and then they opted to enlarge it with all these Eastern European, very very un-Chesedic states that have no order. Yeah, obviously because they were non-Chesedic, they all fell under the Geburah disciplining of Germany very easily. So that was no good for England, and now it just cut itself off. The Germans are obviously this is really really good for the Germans, also because Macron won and Le Pen lost and Wilders lost and Rutte won. So we have this German-minded block of economic powers in the continent that just are about economic austerity and industrial discipline and you know, back channel market, what do you call that, like kind of the German led EU industry is kind of like the Japanese, models itself a little bit after Japanese industrial discipline, which just means share nothing, play the game as insidiously as you can, destroy your opponents. They're entirely out to destroy England. And now they have a whole fucking shitload of allies to do that with. And these allies are entirely dependent on their own fulfillment of the German Geburah conditions if there's ever going to be a Chesedic state. But that Chesedic state, now that Britain is gone from the equation, could actually emerge. There's a lot of stuff that can be said about the changing gene pool of Europe also that has to do with revitalizing dying will to live. That after World War, sort of European population has lost a lot of vigor and its birth rate started declining, which is no doubt one of the reasons of the great immigration waves, just to replenish the genetic vigor, will to procreate. And you can see in this sense that, again, the Germans approach this idea of the fact that actually that has an impact on the gene pool immigration with much more discipline, much more Geburah awareness, which namely they've structurally been importing people of Turkish descent which are just very strong. That's a very strong country. It produces just very strong individuals, vigorous, and then the Germans make the Geburic Chesedic action of forcing them very thoroughly to learn the language and the grammar, which is, I guess, grammar, like language is very much Chesedic. The rules of the language are very much Geburic. The German language, with its case system deriving from the Greeks and Romans, is very Geburic in its Chesed. It's very orderly, structured, tamed lion, self-contained strength, self-referent strength, true structural integrity. That they can deal with the immigration. I often in Holland, you get young German Turks in expensive Mercedes at night, just sort of looking for some weed or prostitutes or whatever, or kind of using Holland as sort of the outskirts of Germany, where things are a little bit danker and maybe more criminal, not as orderly, but you can get some stuff there, at night. And that's what's going to happen to Europe now. That it's going to be the self-conscious, self-disciplined, Bismarckian tradition of Germany, which sort of started up, then caused these two great wars, or triggered them, and then got itself together and just is now the beating heart of the European continent. And there's nothing I can see that can stop that now. So that means Europe will have to start deriving a Chesedic aspect from the German nature. Basically, I think we'll just have to admit that Germany is now the boss of Europe. They kind of won the world wars in the long run. Not kind of, they just won them. So, if Europe is to be something, the EU, a true Chesedic sphere with true values, true positive values, then these are going to be German values. And of course, the Germans very much value the French and the Italians. They're extremely jealous of the French quality of life, and they truly admire the Italians for sort of the same reasons. So there's no threat there. It's not like Hitler is still there. It's not like they're still looking to eliminate whole. They're no longer as banal, and they know how that the way to victory has been the way of silence, of silent discipline, and so they'll continue this likely. And they'll just they'll be in the future decades and centuries, they'll be trying to integrate more Italian and French high culture into their own nation and become the true center of Europe based on true ancient European values centered around their German spine of just pure solidity, true structural integrity. Bismarck really pulled a number on the French and English and the old royalists. That guy forged, that's the Geburic hand of Europe, Bismarck. And then so as a continuation of this lecture on Bismarck, I'll just put a link to a German movie from 1940 on Bismarck, which is an extremely fascinating portrait of the process that forged the German unity, where you can see how Geburah is very clever. It's not brute force. A proper Geburah knows how to scheme, to strategize, and to place parties against each other, divide and conquer. That's again one of those aspects of splitting of the sword, splitting by the sword. Is there anything else I can say? Well, I would express some hope that within this model of Geburah becoming a Chesed, that my own country, Holland, could be tempted to gravitate away from the Snapchat culture and more towards the German culture, learn its own grammar again. I was on the phone with with an institution from my country, and I could literally I had to put the phone away from my ear because the speech that now exists in Holland, that the way young people speak Dutch is so ugly and so retarded, and seems so deliberately retarded, that it's just a disease. It's just truly unbearable. And that's all the culture, Anglo-Saxon culture doesn't really compute all too well with Dutch culture, even though they really want it, but we need a little bit more discipline than that. We do need either French or German high culture in order to even be anything at all. That's what we've always needed, that. Even our national anthem has references to Germany and to Spain in it as being very high and original things. And we are sort of, we also exist. Let us also exist, please, King. And Holland just never managed to have its own high culture, and you really do need high culture to have a Chesedic sphere. So, well, congratulations to Germany in the name of Mars, and I express the hope that my own Holland will go and find its soul with its German neighbors. It was not like they truly resisted the Nazis even. They symbolically sort of went to attack the German tanks with 3 bicycles, were defeated instantly. And they deported the greatest number of Jews, relatively speaking, of all of Europe, I think, maybe even trumping Germany itself. It's just not a country that has any... It's a very prosperous, in a sense, province of Germany with Rotterdam, the port, the biggest port of Europe, I think. So it's essential for Europe, and it should take pride in this. For Germany, it should take pride in this. In a sense, it should Geburahly approach Germany. For, look, guys, you need us, essentially. Necessity. That's the only thing Holland has now going for it. There's nothing Chesedic, there's nothing cultural, nothing literate. People are illiterate. People hate reading, especially if it's not newspapers. It needs to simplify, become very basic, and it's in the process of doing that. And then just become sort of a gatekeeper of the new Europe, the new Chesedic Europe, which relies simply on very, very hard economic discipline, and it is a very cold place. We're going to have to admit that Europe is a fucking cold place. But beautiful. And that's the next Severity.